In the last video, we saw that the Plymouth settlers were bound together by God and the Mayflower Compact. Through the societal glue, God, we see that they were held together and made a seemingly impossible task of creating a colony and a functioning government from nothing possible. The question must then be asked, what happens if you get a colony and try to make it work without God as the social glue? And this is where we get Jamestown. Jamestown has an interesting history and a horrifying start. While Jamestown is the first English settlement here in the United States, it was born of many hardships, some horrifying stories, and near failure for a beginning. Jamestown, much like Plymouth, was in debt to the Virginia Company. They also had a charter that was to allow them to settle in the colony of Virginia, and like the agreement of the Pilgrims, they too were going to be in debt to the Virginia Company until the debt was paid off. There were multiple reasons as to why the Virginia Company allowed the settlers to go to America in the first place. And while the Virginia Company allowed it, the British government also had to be persuaded. During this time, the French and the Spanish were making their move into the New World, and the spread of Catholicism brought worry to the Crown of England. So, under the guise of propagating the Christian religion to such a people as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God, and may in time bring the infidels and savages living in these parts to human civility and to a settled and quiet government. And though spreading the gospel was one of the reasons for going, though it should be noted that among the 104 settlers going to the New World, there were only 2 who were known for their Christianity. One notable among them was the preacher Richard Hunt. However, this was unlike the Pilgrims, who would make their journey 13 years later, and of the 102 passengers, 40 of them were Christians. The other 4 reasons were as follows. 1. To get some of the poor off of the streets. 2. To create new markets for British wool products. 3. To obtain raw materials such as gold and lumber inexpensively. And 4. To find a shortcut to the Indies that would cut costs on oriental spices, herbs, and oils. As Ben Hart put it in his book about the type of people that went on this journey, there was no sense of conventional community, as there was in New England. Some were English gentlemen, while others were artisans, debtors, adventurers, mercenaries, and even criminals. Hence we see division and quarreling among the sojourners almost from the start, and few wanted to work. The New England sense of Christian love and holy endeavor was noticeably absent in early Jamestown. After they had landed in Virginia on May 14, 1607, the colony immediately had issues from the get-go. Remember, the type of most of the people who went were not the studious or hard-working type. Many of these were people of ill repute. But that did not stop Reverend Robert Hunt from making his services mandatory and trying to set the right example for the people of the colony by volunteering for hard labor, such as building Virginia's first grist mill for grinding corn. He knew that the colony's prospects for survival depended on the settlers' ability to sustain themselves, but his example did not matter to the colonists. Again, citing Ben Hart, most of the settlers were content to pan for gold in hopes of getting rich quick and relied on the generosity of the Indians for sustenance. That the natives even bothered was puzzling. Since they were often treated poorly by the settlers, it would be 20 years before Virginia would plant a crop capable of feeding its inhabitants. Eventually, those panning for gold had enough to fill a boat with the ore. The only problem is that it was later discovered that they had gathered pyrite instead of gold. All this panning for gold distracted them from planting crops, which were vital to their survival, which would make the upcoming months hell on earth for them. These men did not have the same mentality as the Puritans, which would make life for them extremely difficult. By the time 6 months had passed from the initial start of the colony, only 30 of the 104 passengers would still be alive. By this point, by any objective measurement, the colony had been a total disaster. In 1609, the Virginia Company had seen a shift in the leadership. Thomas Smythe was made the treasurer, and Lord Delaware was appointed governor. Smythe launched an advertising campaign for new blood to come into the colony, and it was a success. He saw that Virginia's prospects for survival were more than just commercial. He knew he had to intertwine faith and patriotism with commercial success. Thus, the craze for Virginia began. In June of 1609, a fleet set sail with 800 passengers. Unfortunately, the expedition's leaders on board the Sea Adventurer were separated from the other ships, likely due to a hurricane, and were carried to Bermuda Island. John Smith, who was the governor of Jamestown, refused to relinquish his governorship to the new oncoming leadership and tried to point out that the oncoming governor was lost at sea. The new arrivals refused to follow Smith, and those who were loyal to Smith refused to submit to the new settlers. However, due to a gunpowder wound, Smith knew that his deposal was inevitable, and he left the colony and sailed home. For every 10 new people that arrived, 9 died, and during this period of death, even Reverend Robert succumbed and ended the colony's main source of spiritual and moral inspiration. With the absence of the Reverend, the situation grew more dire as the winter of 1609 approached. Frozen bodies were found in beds, and starvation was rampant in the colony. According to one account, corpses were dug from their graves and eaten, and amongst the rest, this most lamentable, that one of our colony murdered his wife, ripped the child out of the womb and threw it into the river, and after chopped the mother into pieces and salted her for food. Governor Delaware finally arrived and concluded that a better sense of community was needed and stricter discipline. However, even he was stricken with sickness and sailed back home, only after 10 months. Even during this period of time, another 150 people died of starvation and sickness. Things finally started to turn around with the arrival of Thomas Dale. You may not like what he did, but nevertheless, he turned the colony around. He brought an iron fist and he ruled with it. He forced people to worship twice on Sunday under military escort. He filled their days with prayer. Anyone who took the name of the Lord in vain could expect a bodkin to be thrust through their tongue, and after a third blasphemous remark, the death penalty. And he was serious about that. He executed 8 offenders. He employed settlers to employment with strict regime under military escort. And while this may seem extreme to us, the situation in Jamestown was very extreme. With freedom, there comes responsibility. And everybody wanted the freedom, but nobody wanted the responsibility. He abolished the original system of indentured servitude, which settlers would be forced to labor for 7 years and only receive the bare necessities for life for their labor, and then they might receive a small plot of land afterward. But there was really no incentive to work. Many of them shirked their responsibilities and panned for gold and cheated the Indians instead of working for the Virginia Company debt that they owed. Instead, under Dale, he restored the right to private property, and after they fulfilled their 7-year contract, he would award them with 50 acres of land, and after 6 years of Dale's reign, Jamestown grew to 1,000, and by 1621, Jamestown would reach 4,000. It's interesting to see how a man so devoted to God and strict to discipline could turn such a disaster of a colony into a fully functioning society within 6 years' time. But what do you think? Was he right for having to enforce such strict measures on the people, or do you think he could have gone a bit softer on them and made just as big as an impact? I personally don't think he would have, but that's just my opinion. However, we see the difference between the two settlements. One was founded on God and godly principles, while the other was founded on selfishness and the lack of God and morality, and people paid dearly for it. That's not to say that there would have been no hardships, because there were certainly hardships in Plymouth, but not to the degree of Jamestown. But you let me know down in the comments below what you think, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Next time on PMS.